It starts off with the examination of a collection of African Kuba cloth.
It has a lot of messages, that Kuba cloth. You could work on it for a long time, how you interpret it, and the mood you pick up from it, from the shapes. You could use the same shapes in different ways, emotionally. It's all there.
From that very direct observational starting point, it enables us to explore how pattern has become a fundamentally important part of both modernist painting but post-modernist art, where the kind of meaning changes from the formal to the societal and to all the kind of multiple complex stories that pattern is capable of holding. The starting point for all of this was I went to visit my daughter in Nairobi, and she was living with an illustrator called Lucy Swan. And Lucy plonked a piece of Kuba cloth on the floor in front of me and said, "I think you might be interested in this." And as she put it down, she said, "Matisse used to love this stuff, and Paul Klee was interested in it, and Picasso was interested in it." So one's interest was immediately piqued by this thing that had held the interest of all these important artists. So having bought some of this stuff, I started doing, I'm not an academic, but doing some sort of very limited research into trying to find out a little bit more about it. So I was buying it in Kenya, but it comes from what is now the Central African Republic, and it's referred to as Congolese Kuba cloth. And there are all sorts of stories and all sorts of ideas about its production. And some of them are in very kind of learned books about textiles and African art. But they don't take us very far. And they do seem very anecdotal. They're made from raffia leaf, and the raffia leaf is this sort of length. They don't spin it, so it's left at that kind of length. So we end up with pieces which are about a couple of feet square. Sometimes the work is tufted, so stitched through and snips, stitched through and snips. Other pieces are appliqued. You make this piece of cloth. This piece of cloth is then softened by pounding. Pounding produces holes, but this is a valuable item, so you've got other pieces which you might use then to patch that. Other things that happen is that holes are made, and then there's a kind of darning process to stop the hole from spreading, so then we get another kind of decoration that happens as a result of that. So that's an account there of perhaps some of the sort of the aspects of the production of the work. But then there's this other thing, which is that you look at it and you're completely absorbed and fascinated by it, and that there are shapes and forms and relationships between the elements of the thing which clearly mean something. And also the sense that these patterns and these shapes and these formal relationships are giving enough of a hint to show us that they come from some understanding of the world in which they were produced. And we have enough of a understanding, it seems to me, a kind of innate understanding of how we have a vocabulary of shape and form and relationship, which comes from our experience of the world. And I think as a painter, this is really fascinating. And again, I can see Matisse's interest or Klee's interest in this, that what one so often as an artist trying to do is trying to find the deep underpinning structures that enable us to both understand the world, but also recognize difference within the world. How important is it that we can recognize the difference between the tiger and the long grass in which the tiger inhabits? And what kind of evolutionary processes have enabled us to take huge pleasure in that kind of recognition, but also how important is it to our survival?
I asked you once, shall I put orange up there, Nick? And you said, you are able, not you're big enough and ugly enough and old enough, but you are able to make your own decisions. And if you make your own decisions, it doesn't matter if they're wrong. If it doesn't work, change it. So I felt if I keep working from it and I'm true to my own decisions, then it will become part of my world that I've grown up in, with my interest in textiles. And now, more than any time in my life, I can't wait to be painting. I want to get there because it is, such a more personal thing now.
My job as a tutor is not particularly to come in as an expert and tell people what to do, but to come in and help people find out what it is that they want to do. What I think I'm doing is creating the circumstances whereby people can make discoveries, and I can make discoveries, and we can work in this a collaborative way to push this idea a little bit further. And it feels like original research. It feels like we can find stuff out which it doesn't exist as a body of knowledge that we can take off the shelf. We're creating it. And I think the other thing that happens in this process then is a very clear example of how paintings and ideas or art is not the product of individuals, it's the product of collections of people. And the Kuba Cloth, we know that with the big skirts that they were produced collectively, and that's mirrored in the studio as well, where consciously and unconsciously there's a vast amount of exchange going on. So we're creating work as a community of artists. And it's really important, this idea that I would go into these classes knowing no more about the subject than the people that were coming on to the classes, and that we would collectively examine the cloth. And we did that by drawing it initially, laying it out and going around making drawings, because drawing, it's an obvious one really, but it's a fantastic way of looking at something very intently, but also translating it.
We spent a lot of time drawing on that course, didn't we, right at the very beginning, and that was a pleasure, that was a real pleasure, and quite a sort of coherent process, which it feels like other things aren't always in quite the same way. I've always painted in layers, and always scraped off, layered again, scraped up, used glazes, and those processes seem to really suit working with the Kuba cloth. I think I became confident doing it, actually. I think I felt I could make judgments.
In order to be able to understand the world, we have to be able to differentiate things from within it. And then we have to take this complex information, and then we have to find other structures and patterns to enable us to present it to the people. There is a reason why the grid has become this kind of fantastically kind of dominant structure within modernist painting, because it enables us to take something enormously complex and enable it to become something that then we can start thinking about. So I think that the work that we do in studying the cloth helps us with some really big fundamental ideas to do with how does art operate, how does working with people's eyes and imaginations, and how do we deploy all of this stuff?
Well, colour's always been vital to me, absolutely vital. Schoolwork wasn't my game, really. I gave up almost everything I didn't like. But painting and literature were the two salient things. So I suppose words are always quite important to me. So that was all about the relationships between the shapes, how they were talking to each other. Then I wanted it to glow. It sounds rather grand. I think there's quite a lot of intellectual thought about it. Yes, a lot of brain power goes into the decisions. It's all quite considered, mostly. I mean, the black marks on that last one that you like, that was instinctive. So there is an element of both.
There are kind of structured ways of thinking, and art school produces certain kinds of structured ways of thinking. One of them is the language that we use of kind of critical decision making. And that can be terrifying. What's your critical decision-making process? Well, I don't know. I think, and for many people, I think that's more interesting than that. And that seems to me that's a really, really interesting critical decision, because it's to do with what's going on in here and what's going on in here, and that looks more interesting than that. And if you make that decision a few times, those kind of comparative, qualitative judgments, you're mining quite deeply in here. And I think because this work, we don't know what it means. So we can make those kinds of judgments without feeling under any pressure there. So there's one thing going on there. I think there's another thing that that the examination of this work and the work that we're making from it does is it enables us to think about the relationship that we have with craft. And when I was a student, the word craft was a kind of dirty word in relation to fine art, as was pattern and as was decoration. Painting took place in rectangles, and it was about the paint and the surface on which the paint was painted, and that textiles was craft and existed somewhere else and was in some way lesser. Later on, we start examining the world in different ways, and postmodernism comes in, and we start thinking about pattern and the histories and the stories that are connected to it. We start thinking about gender. We start thinking about culture. We stop thinking about what's going on in Western Europe as being some sort of pinnacle of achievement. And it's a different ballgame. And it opens up a kind of terrific freedom to work in all sorts of ways without feeling that one's doing it wrong.
Well, they were always quite separate things, and I used to call making my tea cozies my default mode. So when I was feeling I can't do it, I can't paint, I would go to my scraps of fabric and make tea cozies. But it is since coming to the pattern course that they've come together. If I make any more tea cozies, I don't know if I will, because I don't need to now. I don't need to have them separate. It can be one thing.
I used to be a photographic stylist, and in amongst that, they always needed textiles. They needed a curtain or a tablecloth or a tray cloth or whatever. I've always just been drawn to textiles, always. And then, as I say, I just suddenly found myself at college. And the minute I started using linen to weave, I was away, because I just loved it. I used unbleached and bleached linen. You can make the warp quite complicated, which of course is what I did, so you can get texture there, which is the mainstay of the cloth, which means you have to have two beams to weave it, all sorts of things, which for industry was a bit difficult to replicate, but they did. So you take your designs to them and they replicate them industrially on huge looms. I'm weaving this wide and they do it on. But the industrial, getting it produced industrially, and you're sort of removed from it again. And for me now, I realise that I always felt a bit embarrassed because someone else had made the cloth, whereas now it's just down to me. The painting gave me the hands-on, probably, which was I didn't realise how important it was.
There's a thing that we get in the Kuba cloth that is also connected to this idea of personal decision-making. So we choose to go down that route as opposed to that route, and we do it a few times, and suddenly the route that we're taking is very particular to us. But if we've left a visual trail of that decision-making, somebody else can understand it. So they've got this kind of way of sort of getting into the other person's sensibility, psyche. Why did they do that? What was going on that made them make these decisions, and how have these decisions affected how I feel about the work and the outcome of it? It's lovely, isn't it? So a painting or a piece of furniture or any of these things, they're kind of human documents which enable us to communicate and speak and think about each other. And do that again without this terrible question about what is it that I have to say about the world? Well, the thing I have to say about the world is perhaps can be found in the decisions that I make about how I behave within it. So it's not what do I want to communicate, it's what do I communicate when I make things. The mistake we so often do is we think that if it doesn't look like the thing, it's not connected to a deep reading of the thing. And I think this is important. So the looking at this in the students' work might be quite clearly manifest, but I would hope that it might also exist on a much deeper level than that.